Welcome everyone to Dynamic Workspaces Demystified, your path to streamlined data management. Today I am joined by both Dan and Chris as our presenters. So I will hand things over to Dan to give an introduction to himself.
Awesome, thanks Elizabeth. Hey everyone, my name's Dan. I'm a customer solutions specialist here at SAFE, so kind of focused on helping our customers get the most out of FME. Whether that's through coaching them on their FME journey or even providing content like this webinar. And Chris, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, and so I have an easy follow-up after that. I do the exact same thing as Dan, so we're on the same team. We have the same objective, and yeah, we're excited to share a lot of new tips and tricks during this webinar.
Awesome, and we also have Dave joining on the back end with us here today. So if you have any questions during the webinar at all, please do drop those into the questions tab on the bottom right there. And we also do have time at the end, if we have a few minutes there, we'll answer some questions live as well or elaborate on some. And then keep letting us know where you're tuning in from in the chat tab on the bottom right there. If you have any audio or video issues during the webinar, we have that handy help button on the bottom left, and there's 4 simple steps to take there. And share your emoji reactions with us during the webinar. We love to see those, see how everyone's feeling throughout. And lastly, our polls tab. We do have a few polls coming up today, so definitely make use of that tab. Keep an eye out for those, and you can cast your votes as we go along here. And if you'd like to download the slide deck, you can do so by clicking the button on the top right of the PDF deck there, and it will download direct for you. All right, and just before I pass it over to the team, I will get the presenters on stage here. If we can all turn off our webcams just to save on some bandwidth for the remainder here. All right, and I will pass it off for the agenda.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so we have a good lead in today. So we'll start off with a bit of an agenda followed immediately by a poll. So you'll get action on that polls tab very quickly here. What we're going to cover today is, generally speaking, an introduction to components of a dynamic workspace and compare that to a fixed schema workflow or a standard workspace that you're probably familiar with authoring in FME. We'll then dive into a couple of use cases and demos, and I'll hand things over to Dan at the schema scanner point. That's where he'll take over with some demos on the schema scanner, talk a little bit more about advanced dynamic workflows, and of course, like every other webinar, we'll wrap up with conclusion, resources, and Q&A. As we're going through, Elizabeth mentioned that we do have Dave on the back end running Q&A, so if you do have any questions, please do get those in on the questions panel. Add to the chat as well if you have any comments as we're going. We love to see your interaction throughout these webinars. So the first poll that we want to start off with is just to get a sense of how often you're actually using FME. Previously, we've asked this question is how many years of FME experience do you have? But we actually want to know in this instance, how many hours do you use FME weekly? And that could be from FME Form or FME Flow. Basically, anytime you're interacting with an FME product, whether that is something as simple as a web app or you're actually authoring a workspace, we'd love to hear what your experience with that is on a weekly basis.
I'm not sure. Are we surprised by how we've got the majority of votes already? It's quite split.
Yeah, that's great to see. So pretty close race between people who are using it about 1 to 5 hours and 6 to 10. I think those are going to be neck and neck by the end of this. And a few more power users, and that 17% are using it more than 20 hours a week. So we have great representation from all levels of users, it looks like.
Yeah, it looks like even the bottom 2 are still about 15% each of the audience. So quite a range there.
Yeah, it's good spread across them.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for providing us with that information. So we will obviously cater the webinar to that level then. It's kind of spanning across the more advanced users to intermediate. So we'll keep it to that level. And of course, you're in that intermediate to advanced bucket because you're here learning about dynamic workflows. So of course, today we are going to be talking about the FME Enterprise Integration Platform. And specifically in this webinar, we're going to be focusing more on the FME Form side of things. So we're going to be more in the environment of building and running your data workflows. but we do also have the ability to automate those dynamic workflows. And we'll give you a little taste on some use cases and how you can actually do that. Of course, that could be done on FME Flow if you're deploying that on-premise, or with Flow hosted, again, depending on the formats that you're going to be interacting with or your organization's requirements. That'll kind of determine whether you're going to be on Flow or Flow hosted. Again, the main focus for today, we will be in FME Form, talking more about the dynamic workspaces and workflows and how to author those and all the intricacies included with those. For those of you who are basically brand new to FME, of course, we do also have a rich format gallery that allows you to connect with all types of data. So we started back in 1994 in the CAD and GIS space, and we've progressed over time to include things like point clouds, IoT, gaming formats, indoor mapping, and now we're getting into the cloud native formats as well. So if you're ever curious about FME's capabilities in terms of the formats or systems that we can support, you simply just type on the canvas and it'll give you a short list of all the transformers, readers, and writers that are available to you on FME Form. But here we're obviously talking mainly about dynamic workspaces. So what is a dynamic workspace? This is something that integrates data without any predefined source or destination schemas, and this allows them to be extremely adaptive and versatile. So you can typically identify these on a canvas just from that screenshot on the very bottom there as something that indicates all, which means there are more than one associated feature types with that reader feature type on the canvas. And on the writer side, it'll actually be flagged as something that is dynamic. And that means it's going to be fully data-driven. You don't necessarily have to have your schema exposed on the canvas unless you're using specific attributes for a transformer. Generally speaking, you can just have these be fully data-driven. So the source can change, the destination can change. You could have the destination as a fixed schema, but the source can be different schemas. There are a number of different patterns that you can actually execute these dynamic workspaces on. The same would go for geometry in this case. Obviously, FME is a spatial platform, but you can do non-spatial workflows for these as well. So if you have different source data sets with different schemas as well as different geometries, those still apply in this dynamic workspace concept. It can be fully data-driven to set the schema on the output format or system. And we'll go over that in just a few slides here. So why would you use a dynamic workspace? Generally speaking, the main benefits of this are you don't have as many things to maintain. They're really good for more simplified workspaces where you can execute these against multiple files that may have some varying differences between them, or if you just need something to be a quote-unquote easy translator. So there's a lot of different use cases for making your workspaces be fully data-driven, and obviously maintenance, minimal long-term maintenance is kind of paramount on that. You don't have to maintain individual workspaces for what are called fixed schema workflows. So you no longer have to create one workspace per file. You can kind of apply it to a batch of files or a batch of tables for your databases. It allows them to be a lot more flexible and can roll with the changes between data types, attributes, or even some slight variations between the schemas. And we'll have a couple of great examples of these coming up here. A fixed schema workspace is something that I believe all of our training resources kind of start with. So if you've ever gone through any of our training resources or any of our tutorials on the community, this is typically how you're going to start your FME workspace. You'll drag a file into FME Workbench, and you'll see there'll be the reader feature type that appears on the canvas, which is what you're seeing on that screenshot below there. And you can typically expand that and see what associated schema you have with that. And then you pick your destination format or your destination system, you add the writer for that, and you connect the two. And in most cases, you're going to have it set to what is called the automatic attribute definition, which means it's going to pick up the schema of any of the incoming features, whether that's from transformers or readers or anything in between there, and it'll add that to the writer feature type. And that's going to be your output schema. So these are extremely tightly bound to the source and destination schemas, where you now have to maintain that if there are any changes to the source schema, or you need to update the data types or like an attribute name on the writer side, you have to do those individually, and they're a lot more you have a lot more control over this, obviously, which is beneficial for specific workflows, but it is more to maintain at the end of the day. A dynamic workspace, or a dynamic schema, on the other hand, is something that will be able to pick up multiple files where the schema is now not relevant. You don't actually need to have this defined in the workspace, because this will allow it to run through the workflow and either be a mirror of the source schema. It could be a schema derived from external data set, or you can kind of define these based on a number of different patterns. Again, we have a great tutorial series that walks you through the various options, and I'll go through a demo of mirroring an image source data set in just a little bit here. But this is where workspaces are really fully data driven at this point. You can send in 5 different files with 5 different schemas, and those have different associated geometries, and you can write them out all to the same output format or same system. So this is a great example where if you're working with something like an open data portal and you only have five formats that you can download, but you needed to get it into something like a GeoBuff or a shapefile, for example, you can take that, and if you know that your team will constantly be downloading from that list of 5 and they always need to transform it into that, the schemas will obviously change with those files from the open data portal, but now you only have to maintain the one workspace so they can actually upload that to convert it to a new, the new format that you need on the outside. So the key components of a dynamic workspace is starting with the source. We'll kind of start on the reader side and work our way through this logically. On the reader side, you will use a single merged feature type, and this will enable dynamic inputs. So when you're adding a reader to the canvas, you have the option for individual feature types, which means one feature type will be added to the canvas essentially per layer or per table name. So if you're working in a CSV context, per CSV file, you'll have one new feature type. For a database, for each table, you'll have a reader feature type for each table in the database, and so on and so forth. By merging these into one, it allows it to be what's called a dynamic reader. So this combines the schemas of all of them. It doesn't have any requirement to actually see the schema on the canvas. That's all handled on the writer side. You'll notice this if you go into the reader feature type. There is something in that lower section that we have highlighted there that's called merge feature types. So if you miss this step when you're adding your reader to the canvas, you can still do this from the canvas level just by editing the reader feature type. This is where you can set a merge filter. I don't know many use cases where individuals have specifically set a filter, but that is something that is extremely helpful to know is available if you are trying to shortlist specific allowed values for input systems or formats. On the writer side, since you can kind of have these working independently or cohesive as one workspace, this is where the writer is configured for a dynamic schema. Similar to how you're adding your reader to the canvas and setting it to that single merged setting, with the writer, you can set it to the feature type definition called dynamic, or it's called dynamic advanced in this case. And this is where you'll see on the writer feature type level, you'll have a checkbox for dynamic schema definition, and you can set where that schema is actually being set from. We're going to go through a couple of examples, and Dan has a couple of tips for the schema scanner specifically, so that'll be more applicable to the schema definition name. But having the ability to set this per feature essentially allows you to do a lot of advanced things with this workflow, like feature types, or sorry, fan outs rather, which Dan will also be covering later on in the webinar. But the main things that we can kind of highlight here are on the geometry and schema sources side. You can see that it is set from the schema definition or from the input system essentially, and the same thing would apply for the schema sources. You can choose whether that's coming from a schema feature or from a specific, in this case that would be the reader, or an external data set. So you have a lot of great control over how you actually want to define these dynamic workspaces. So that is probably a lot. We're going to get into a demo in just a little bit here, but there is one very easy place to start with this if you're just wanting to see what a dynamic schema or dynamic workflow can do for you. Honestly, the easiest place to start is just use that Generate Workspace tab button on the Start menu and set it to Dynamic Schema. So this is where you can actually set your reader and writer from kind of like a walkthrough wizard, if you may. And this will allow you to set your workspace parameters for your inputs and your outputs and tell it to create a dynamic schema for you, so you don't actually have to configure any of these. This would be the simplest use case where you just want to read and write to like one system to another or one file to another. And this would allow you to have that workspace created for you, essentially hands-free. You don't have to do anything other than fill out those reader and writer parameters. There's no connecting lines or anything. It'll do that all for you. I'm going to transition very slightly into automating these dynamic workspaces because, of course, we're talking about the FME platform here. So you can still take all of these dynamic workflows that you have built in FME Form and publish them to FME Flow, and they can be run in things like Flow workspace apps. They could be run in automation technically, or from the REST API as well. So all the same capabilities apply with running these on the FME Flow side of things. There's one note to make here specifically about automations, as this is not to get confused with the run a dynamic workspace option. The run a dynamic workspace option is something that takes the concept of a dynamic workspace and applies it to automations. So this allows an automation to become fully data-driven, similar to the way that a dynamic reader or dynamic writer allows the workspace level to be fully data-driven. This is another way to think of it is similar to like a conditional statement on an automations canvas. So you're allowing the workspace to define which workspace will run in the automation. So the same thing would apply here for those automations as well. Main benefits of using running the run a dynamic workspace action instead of a run a workspace action is this allows it to be data-driven and executed at runtime rather than author time. So it's more hands-off. You don't have to maintain that automation to the same degree as the data is kind of allowing the automation to determine what workspace will run. Similar to how on a dynamic workspace, it would allow it to define which schema is written to the end system. Okay, so we have our second poll here before we start to transition into our first demo. One question that we have with this is, would you find value in and attending a webinar on building a dynamic automation? So this would be specific to that, that run a dynamic workspace action. So if you're curious about creating data-driven or dynamic automations, let us know in that polls tab. We'd be very curious to see if that is an area of interest. And yes, it's off to a commanding lead, it looks like. Okay, so that is one that we'll have to keep in mind for the near future here.
Wow, yeah. It's a resounding yes for the most part.
Yeah. And if you are using the run a dynamic workspace action already, in the chat, just let us know if you have a simple 1 to 2 sentence overview of what you're actually doing with that. It'd be great to hear what you're up to with those dynamic run a dynamic workspace actions. Okay. All right, so just to kind of round out what we had on that automations piece again. So again, similar concepts, similar benefits that you have here with the automations. It allows it to be more flexible and executes on the runtime rather than author time. Allows for continuous integration. Same thing would apply on a dynamic workspace where you can add new files as you're kind of going, and the workspace will be able to keep up with that. So the same benefits apply to both the the workspace level where you're building a dynamic workspace with dynamic readers and writers as those automations. The concepts are similar, just different products essentially. So let's get into some use cases. This is what everyone's here for. Start off with a quick demo here. I'm just going to shuffle around my screen. Okay, so we should be seeing FME Workbench now. So this is the Canvas environment that you're going to build your workflows with, and we're going to start off just by adding a CSV reader. So again, all the capabilities of FME are very easy to discover. You simply just start typing on the canvas, and in this case, I'm going to add a CSV reader. All of these files have been graciously provided by the City of Vancouver's Open Data Portal. So I have downloaded the bikeways, business licenses, and street trees options. So we're going to go through a very basic example of creating a dynamic workspace. I have it configured with the individual feature types by default. So what I actually want to do is set it to single merge feature type like we already discussed in that earlier slides. And we'll see that once we add this to the canvas, there is a single all reader feature type here. If I wanted to go to let's go to shapefile, for example. If I want to go to a shapefile, I can now specify my output folder. Let's just go here. Actually, I changed my mind. I want to go to GeoPackage. Let's go to GeoPackage and do the same thing here. So we'll create it on that output folder. The attribute table definition in this case, instead of using automatic, which is the default selection, we're actually going to choose dynamic here. We'll add that to the canvas. And we'll connect those two. The reason I've switched up to GeoPackage is because the City of Vancouver actually allows you to download a shapefile, so that wouldn't have been a very good example here. What we can see is by expanding the schema here, since it's dynamically set, there's actually no schema defined on the writer feature type. The same thing would apply to the readers, but in this case, you're actually getting all of the schemas from all three of those files that we're reading in. So it's a very messy thing. The one thing that you would expect to happen here is that all of the schemas would be applied to the writer feature type, but that's not the case since we're being set dynamically per that reader. So we've configured it so it's set to that CSV reader input. So as that file changes, it will actually define that on the writer side. We can create that if needed, and we can essentially go ahead and run this. I have some other components just above, so that's why there were additional parameters here. And as that's going to run, it's going to go through those three files, and we've already created that quickly. Oh, I've actually run into an error there. But we do have the output file here. So this was just created at 8:20, and that has our three new files on it. So I'm going to slide up to here, where now we'll just show you the differences between what a CSV to GeoPackage dynamic versus a CSV to GeoPackage fixed example would look like. Oh, looks like that was picked up by that bookmark. Apologies there. So in practice, this is essentially what's happening. The top bookmark is taking the single merge CSVs, where it's taking the schemas and defining it per file on the writer side and writing it out to an individual GeoPackage file. Could obviously go to an individual GeoPackage table as well. I'll just view here that in this case, I've exposed only a single geometry attribute just to show the use case of you can still actually leverage exposed attributes on the canvas if needed. They don't have to be very basic bare bones workspaces where it's only a reader and a writer. You can still use those transformers to perform specific actions if the schema has a common attribute across all of them. So in this case, all of the files have that geometry attribute, and I know that contains some GeoJSON, so I can use the geometry replacer here to create that geometry and remove it since we're going to a spatial format. And then I can set the coordinate system because, again, in this case, they're all common. They're all using lat-long 84. So this is essentially the goal here. What we're going for is creating a simple workspace that we can run repeatedly just using different files. So I can run through that business licenses file and expect that to create a business licenses GeoPackage. The same thing would apply for bike paths. It should create a bike paths GeoPackage as well. And then the same thing would apply for the street trees. If I were to do this on a fixed schema level, this is where I would have to maintain individual reader feature types, where I've added the bikeways, business licenses, and street trees. I can still perform those same steps, but individually these schemas are being carried across with the features rather than just kind of dynamically not needing to be exposed and writing on the output side. So in this case, I would actually have to do an additional step, which would be adding a feature type filter here to separate those schemas out because all of these have different schemas. So we can see very quickly here that between the business licenses and bikeways, there's different schemas just right off the top 5. You can see very clearly here. So there's no need to handle these individually on that per feature type basis with a dynamic workspace. So I'll put those back here. So that ends up saving you time and maintenance because as files are changing or as new files are becoming available on the Open Data Portal, I don't need to go ahead and add these to the canvas. I can simply just leave this configured as a single merged reader feature type. And that allows my users or myself to download a new file and run it through the same step rather than opening up the workspace, adding the new reader, adding a new writer, and then running it. So it saves you that maintenance and that downtime of trying to maintain those processes. So you can expect to see, this is kind of the output that I have going on here for that workflow that I had above. You have the 3 separate files. And again, on the output side, you can still see as I click through, the schema will change below. You can actually click on the tabs here too. So we have folder year, licenses, and in this case, it's cultivar name and common name. So you can see the schemas are changing as well as the geometry because we're working with bike lanes, which are obviously lines, and then things like trees, which would be points. We zoom in really close because there's a lot of them. So yeah, that is a quick look at some of the benefits of using a dynamic workspace and kind of comparing it to what a fixed schema workflow could look like. There's obviously benefits of not having to maintain the workspace to the same extent and allows your users to be able to run their workflows without having to ask for updates to that workspace. So we'll switch back into the slides here and just cover off some of the closing benefits before handing things over to Dan on the schema scanner side of things. So I went through a couple of examples there, from a very basic one, just using a source and destination where there weren't any transformers in between. It was simply just running that reader and changing as the files were coming through. We also went through an example of exposing an attribute on the canvas, so you can still use those attributes in a workspace. That can still allow your data to be fully, or your workspace to be fully data-driven, but still have some transformation steps in there as well. So the first example that we showed was using the schema as a mirror image of the source data, and that was just simply taking the schema from that file that was coming through the reader and applying it to the writer without having to define it on the writer feature type. The other option that you have there is, one of the many options that you have actually, is to set the destination schema from an external data set. So if you know that the source will always change, but your destination schema needs to be consistent or fit a certain mold, you can still apply that concept. You need to do something called add a reader as a resource, and that'll allow you to still have a dynamic workflow where the reader can be dynamic and the writer will fit to a specific mold. So you have a lot of configuration options with how you actually want to execute and run these dynamic workspaces. And yeah, we'll go ahead with that chat storm. So if you do have a dynamic workspace use case that you have already, feel free to let us know if there's a quick overview of what that's actually doing in your organization, or how your organization is actually leveraging these. We'd love to hear more about how you're actually using dynamic workspaces. And this one might require a little bit of typing, so apologies. I think we'll kind of keep going with the webinar at this point until we can start to hand off to Dan as you're typing those out.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I just see you've got one of them in there, finding multiple geometries in Oracle tables, which sounds like an awesome use case. And I'm sure there's more out there, and I'm sure there's some that are still learning about dynamic workflows and have come here to learn about them. So maybe you're not using them yet, and you might use them later, which is also great. So the schema scanner transformer, this is kind of diving a bit more into the advanced side of things. I wouldn't say it's particularly super advanced or complex, but the schema scanner transformer itself is a very useful tool when it comes to dynamic workflows, and it's probably saved me a couple times when my dynamic writer hasn't been writing out the schemas properly. So the schema scanner transformer allows you to easily extract the schema from your data set, and how this differs from, say, a feature reader, which can read in your schema directly when you read in your data, is that you can use the schema scanner anywhere in your workflow. So you can have this placed right before your dynamic writer and have it rescan the schema, make sure the schema is correct, and you can even use a couple different parameters in there to adjust the data types and bulk remove any attributes that you want to remove. So if anyone here is familiar with the schema setter transformer that used to exist on the FME hub, this is essentially replacing that. So this is introduced in FME 2021 and performs some of the similar processes, but is now a dedicated transformer within FME as opposed to being a transformer sitting on the FME hub. So it processes features and retrieves the schema of features that pass through it. And the resulting output is a new schema feature that comes out of that schema port. That new feature is also given the special attribute and value, FME schema handling. So that kind of tells the writer later in your workflow that this is only to be used as a schema, and it won't write out any of the features there to your data set. So why would you want to use the schema scanner? How is this useful in your workflows? And especially when you're working with dynamic workflows, where does this have its place? So you might want to use the schema scanner when you want to ensure the dynamic writer is receiving a valid schema. As I mentioned before, I've found in some cases, the schema's changed somehow before it reaches the writer, especially when you're working with larger workspaces. It's harder to find that point where it's breaking. And I found that the schema scanner, placing that right before your writer, is very useful for kind of resolving any of those issues. You may not know the schema of incoming data before it meets the dynamic writer, and you want to ensure that it meets certain standards. So you can use the schema scanner to pull out the schema, maybe do some analysis on the schema before you write, and then do some checks before allowing those records to be written out. And we'll go over a bit of a workflow similar to that in a little bit in a schema drift or schema validation workflow. And you might also want to modify the schema before writing it out and rescan that before reaching the dynamic writer. So you might be adding in new attribute values, you might be calculating new values for those existing attributes, and that's where the schema scanner, again, comes in use. So one of the key parameters in the schema scanner is the output schema before data features. And essentially with the writers in FME, your dynamic writers, they must receive a schema first before incoming data. So in some cases where the data is reaching the writer first, you might run into a frustrating scenario where you go and check your folder where you expect your data to be output and there's nothing there. And a lot of times that can be caused by the data reaching the writer first and the schema kind of lagging behind there. So the schema scanner, in this case, I recommend setting that parameter to yes. It won't really affect your workflows if it's not set to yes, or if it is set to yes. So in most cases, you can just leave it as is, and you shouldn't run into any issues. We also have the ignore attributes containing parameter. So this is a very useful parameter, not only for cleaning up your schema and maybe doing some bulk attribute removal, but it's also useful for removing any format attributes. So when the schema scanner scans the schema of your features, it's going to be picking up everything. So that includes those format attributes. When you go into FME and observe your schema, you'll see there might be, if you're reading in a CSV data set, you might see CSV line number. And if it's a file geodatabase, you might see format attributes relative to that. So that's something to keep in mind when you're using the schema scanner, that you might need to run it once first, see all the different attributes that have been picked up by the schema scanner, and then use the ignore attributes containing to specify a regular expression to catch any of those that you don't want. So in the example here, I've just used the prefix. So in this case, we might have FME underscore, and then I've used the pipe delimiter to separate those regular expressions, and that will capture all of those different attributes for us. So the output from the schema scanner is a list attribute. So you can go into your feature information window and observe the schema and check what it looks like. One of the other things here is that the schema scanner will produce an attribute called FME feature type name, and this is essentially how you're linking your data to the schema produced by the schema scanner. So for the schema scanner, this is most times going to be the name of FME feature type that already exists on your data set. And you can also change the name of this parameter if you want, if it's already being used for something else. And underneath, you can see all your different attributes there. So you've got your the name there, which is the name of the attribute, and then the data type that FME has picked up. So again, that's also very useful. You can, on the fly, dynamically change any of those values. If you want to, say, change varchar 24 to a longer string length, then that can be really useful too. And as I mentioned before, the schema scanner is not the only transformer that can pull in a schema from a feature. We also have the feature reader. So whenever you have your feature reader set up and you run that, it's going to pull in a schema feature for each of your feature types on your specified data set. So again, just something to keep in mind if you are just looking to extract the schema. But the schema scanner, you'll be able to pull out that schema at any point in your workflow. So it's a little more flexible in that sense. So let's go into a bit of a demo here to kind of get an understanding of what the schema scanner might be used for. So in this case, we want to fan out our data based on the date attribute in a farmer's market data set. So typically you could do this with just a dynamic writer, but in this case, we have multiple data sets with different schemas, and we also want to change them before the data is written out. So because we have multiple data sets and because the schemas are different, we're going to need to use the schema scanner to rescan the schema and use the group by parameter to then group our data by the day attribute as opposed to having it written out by the different data sets. The result then is going to be a CSV file for each day of the week. And again, that's even after we've altered the schema. So I'll share my screen here. All right. So we just pull up FME Workbench here, and we've got our dynamic reader. You can see when we look over here, we've got two different data sets, CSV data sets that we're reading in. We'll run our reader here. All right, there we go. So we've read in those features from our CSV reader. And you can see we have pretty similar schemas, but one of our data sets doesn't have the market type attribute. So these are going to have different schemas. And if we were to just use a dynamic writer, then this would write out as two different data sets here. In the attribute manager, we're also creating a new attribute called hours. So we're using the opening and closing times to calculate a new hours value. So when we inspect that, you can see we've now also edited the schema in a sense by creating a new attribute. So we'll need to pick that up again before we write out our features. So we have our hours here. And then in our schema scanner, again, you can see we've specified the group by the day. And we've also set the output schema before data features to yes. And we've specified our regular expression. So if we open this up, this should capture any attribute with the FME underscore at the beginning or the CSV underscore or the multi underscore. So again, those are just format attributes that the schema scanner is picking up. The schema scanner will pick up everything on your data set. So again, just something to keep in mind. And as I mentioned before, we have a couple different parameters here. So if you wanted to, for numeric or different data type strings, you want to handle leading zeros, then there's ways to deal with that, as well as some date handling here. And you can see by using the group by parameter, we now get 4 output schemas. So we'll go in here. And if I open our feature information window, it's just hiding on the left here, you can see we have our new exposed attribute called FME feature type name. And when we expose our attributes, click expand all, then you can see we get our list of different attributes here. So this is after rescanning our schema, and based on the day of the week, it'll be maybe different depending on which attributes were available to the schema scanner. And I'd just like to point out here, if I removed the ignore attributes containing, let's see if we can get that to run again. You can see if I select one of the schemas here, you're going to be getting a few different unwanted parameter or attributes here. So that's why I was mentioning you'll probably want to use that ignore attributes containing parameter to just clean up the schema, since it is going to pick up all of those format attributes. On our writer here, one important thing is that our CSV file name here that we've set to our dynamic value will need to match up with our FME feature type name. So I could also set this to FME feature type name. That is probably best practice in most cases. But in this case, I've just set it to the day for clarity. And then when running your, before running your dynamic writer, you'll also want to change your schema sources. So most of the time, it'll be set to the data set that you've read in your workspace with the reader, but you'll want to set this to the schema from schema feature. Click OK, and then you'll want to set your schema definition name to FME feature type name. So again, this is that attribute that's being created by the schema scanner, and the name on the FME feature type name attribute will dictate which features get written out with what schema. And if I go to inspect our output here, you can see we have our 4 different data sets, depending on the day of the week, and they might have different schemas based on the data contained within the source data set. So that's just kind of an overview of the schema scanner. Hopefully gives you an idea of how it could be used in a workspace, but this is, again, just a very kind of high level overview of the schema scanner. It's got a lot more use cases. It can be just used, again, as I mentioned before, to scan your schema before writing out to ensure that your schema is correct. I found that helps a lot. But yeah, so let's dive into a more advanced workflow here. So previously we've been talking about dynamic workspaces and how those work. We've had our dynamic readers, our dynamic writers, and our schema scanner. But in this case, we're going to be looking more at a dynamic workflow. And when we're talking about a workflow, we're thinking about more of a whole built out process. And in this case, we're going to be using FME Form alongside FME Flow to build out this workflow. So in this case, we want to use the schema scanner to be able to identify and respond to changes in the schema of incoming data. So you can imagine we have a workspace where users can submit their data. We want them to be able to validate the schema before they actually load that data into a database. So FME can automatically identify, flag, and address that schema mismatch. So by creating this workflow, we're able to eliminate any downstream processes from being disrupted. The flow app that we've created looks a little bit like this. So the user could upload their file to the FME Flow Workspace app, and upon running the Workspace app, it'll send that file through their workspace. It'll validate the schema against a base schema, and then it will then pull in and load those features into a database. So you could really implement this workflow into, other workspaces. It doesn't have to be you only have the schema validation happening. The schema validation could be a part of a larger workspace as well. And the report will look something like this. So on the left there, you've got your successful report. Will get an information on the valid attributes and that the data was successfully loaded. And on the right, we have a schema check failed. So it will give us information about unexpected attributes. So attributes in the schema that don't match the existing data set. And then we also have missing attributes. So attributes that exist in the existing schema that are missing in the user uploaded data set. So at the workspace level, what does this look like? So on the left there, we're first reading in our data. We've got our base data set. So on the base data set, we're just reading in one feature, and we're using the schema scanner to pull in the schema features. In this case, you could also use the feature reader instead. It doesn't have to be the schema scanner, but in this case, we're using the schema scanner just to show one of its use cases. And then we're pulling in just that schema feature and using a list exploder to explode the list into a feature or one record per each attribute. So by pulling those records out from the list, we're able to then compare that name column in our change detector. So you can see on our base data set at the top there, we have our path ID, path name, path length, and path type. And then our user provided data set example on the bottom there, we have path ID, path name, and distance. So just a couple of mismatches there, and that's going to be picked up by the change detector. So in the change detector, we've set it to detect changes on the name column there. So if we have any unexpected attributes, then that will come out of the inserted port. If any are missing, then that will be coming out of the deleted port. And then if there are any that are unchanged, so they match between the two, then that will come out of the unchanged port. In the ideal scenario that we have a valid data set that's being loaded in by the user, all of those features are going to come through the unchanged port there. And that tells us that the schema hasn't changed between our base data set and our user provided data set. So to validate our features, we know that any of those features coming out of the inserted and the updated ports, or the inserted and the deleted ports, are going to be telling us that the schema that the user has uploaded is no longer valid. So we can use the variable setter to set a global variable called invalid schema, and we'll set that value to yes. And how this works is that if any features come out of the unchanged port as well as the other ports, it's going to pick up that variable and then go through the tester and then tell it that the rest of the schema isn't valid, so don't send these features to load into the Spatialite database. If only features coming out of that unchanged port, so we'll just go back here, that unchanged port here, and that's getting fed into the feature holder there. If there weren't any features coming out of the other ports, then there won't be a value assigned to the invalid schema attribute. So in this case, it'll pass the test and will then get sent to write out to the database. For the schema report generation, we're just using a few HTML report generators, and what that's doing is that's creating some headers as well as some tables using the presets provided in there. And then we're using the HTML layouter to lay out that HTML to make it look a little bit nicer before writing it out. You could also have your reports generated in PDF or different formats if you wanted, or just sent out as an email. The last step here is to integrate our valid features. So we're able to use the feature merger to merge our features back in from our original reader. So if you recall, on our reader there, we only pulled out that schema using the schema scanner, but we also have that connected up to our feature merger here, and that will just pull in all those features. This will only run if the validation was successful. So if we go back here, look at our tester here, if features come through that passport there, then that's going to kick off the feature merger and pull those features back in. This isn't the only way you can do it. I'm sure there's lots of other different ways, but this is just kind of the example I've come up with here. And then, of course, we're going to be doing some attribute cleanup with attribute remover, since the variable setter and variable retriever added on an additional attribute we don't want there. And then the last step is just to load that data into the database using our dynamic writer. All right, so let's go into a demo of how that looks. So as you can see here, we've got some instructions on the Workspace app. This is relatively easy to create. This parameter here is essentially a user parameter within our workspace that we created. So with our Workspace apps, we're able to also hide other parameters. So we don't want users to be able to edit the location of where the HTML gets written out or the Spatialite database. So we can hide those parameters in our Workspace app, and then we'll just expose a single parameter, and that's the dataset to validate parameter. So let's go find that dataset. We need to go back here and schema detection, and let's pull in an updated dataset. So with this dataset, we're going to expect that we get a validation failed report. So we'll run that. And as you can see, we get our results here, which is our schema check failed and the upload was halted. We get our unexpected attributes. So this is a bit of a different data set than the one I showed earlier. You can see that the case doesn't match here, as well as there is a few different attributes that are missing. And if I go back and let's run that with what should be a valid data set, you can see we get a schema validation successful report, and that all the attributes were valid and were loaded into the database. And we'll just want to pull up that workspace so we get a bit of an overview of what was going on there. So as I mentioned before, with our final step there, when our features come through the tester, they're then pulled into the feature merger here. And this feature holder is actually linked up to our original reader here. So it's just going to be essentially the whole workflow is that if our features pass validation, then they'll be allowed to be run through into that Spatialite writer. All right, so one last poll here for everyone that we wanted to ask is, have you used the schema scanner before? So I'm kind of curious to know, we've had this transformer out for a few years now, since 2021, but I'm sure it's one of the more niche transformers, so I'm kind of curious to see who's used it before. Awesome, so we've got a few that haven't explored it yet. Sounds like a few might look into it after this webinar, which is great to hear. We do have a few different resources on the schema scanner and how to use it. So definitely check those out on our knowledge base. And it looks like we've got a smaller amount, but also great to hear that they've used the schema scanner in their workspaces before. All right, and that leads us to our conclusion. So a little bit of a summary on what we've learned today. So with our dynamic workspaces, we're able to handle changing inputs, feature types, and attributes. And really this helps us to keep our workspaces simpler, cleaner, and easier to manage, especially when our workspaces in general are not too complex, and maybe we're just doing a read and a write, so a one-to-one kind of translation there. It can be really useful for those scenarios where we have lots of different formats and data sets coming through. The schema scanner is also useful for enhancing those dynamic workflows, whether that's for troubleshooting your schema before it reaches the dynamic writer, or maybe you want to edit the schema on the fly. It can be really useful for that as well. And as I just showed, advanced dynamic workflows aren't limited to just reading and writing data. We can also do things such as performing validation checks there. So a little bit about Safe Software. If you didn't know about us before, we've been recognized as one of the top data integration tools here. So we're recognized as the customer's choice in North America for the mid-size enterprise segments. And we've been around for over 30 years. So as Chris mentioned, since the 90s, and we have over 200,000 users worldwide and a growing FME community as well. So just going to plug the FME community. That's a great place to ask questions, get help from other users. I'm sure we have quite a few active community users on this webinar right now. So definitely go check that out if you have some questions that you want to ask, or if you want to see if someone's asked a question similar to one that you have. And Chris mentioned this one earlier. We have a whole tutorial series for our dynamic workflows. So that's on our knowledge base, and we'll have all these resources sent out after the webinar as well. And then we also have our schema scanner article. So that has all the details on the schema scanner, how you can use it, how it works, and a couple of different examples in there. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, we've got our webinars such as this one. I know Elizabeth mentioned we have one coming up with Esri as well that you could check out. The knowledge base, again, is a great place to get some more information there on whether that's dynamic workflows or something else you want to learn about. And then we also have our ebook and our FME Academy for more learning. So again, we love to say that we have lots of free resources here, so we definitely recommend checking those out. And Elizabeth, I think I'll pass it off to you here.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so we do have some audio-based learning as well through our podcasts available at EM360. So check that out. Might be a good, learning resource on your way to or from work. And then in terms of next steps, join us in Seattle this May 6th to 8th for our peak of data integration. We're expecting it to be our largest yet. The call for presentations is currently open. There's a QR code there on the deck if you'd like to apply for that and you haven't yet to do so. Registration opens in 6 days out from today. contact us to chat about anything data. We'd love to help you with any solutions that you are looking for. I'll send the link to email us out now. There you see it at the bottom left. And the FME Accelerator. It's a great 90-minute free of charge course to get started. The FME community badge code, I will drop that in the chat. And as Dan mentioned, FME community is a great place to network with other users and get any questions that you might need answered. So I've dropped that in the chat there. And with that, we have a few minutes here for some Q&A. So I'll invite our presenters to join us on the stage, and Dave as well, if you'd like. You're welcome to join too. And we can take a look at the questions tab together here.
Okay, yeah, there was one from about the dynamic workspace update feature layers in ArcGIS Online. I thought this was a great question. So there are a couple of things to note on that one. I believe you'd have to configure the writer to overwrite the existing feature service, so that might not be desirable. If you're just referring to if a dynamic like schema scanner or works or reader as a resource rather will pick up the new schema, I believe the answer is yes there. So that should work in an ArcGIS Online dynamic workflow concept. So let us know if you do have any specific questions about that. That would be a great question to have on the FME Q&A forum if you're running into any issues or looking for advice on that one.
Yeah, it was a great question. Well, I guess question and suggestion, I agree with this one. The schema scanner ignore format attribute parameter could be adjusted a little bit to exclude those format attributes. I think this is a totally valid suggestion, and I think we'll probably look into talking with the project managers about this, since I think, you know, this was something I also ran into myself using the schema scanner when I first used it, that it does kind of trip you up. So it does kind of defeat the dynamic nature of it, and would definitely improve the schema scanner. So thanks for bringing that one up, Dustin.
See what else we have on the go here. Yeah, so there's a number of people who have asked about the workspaces that we showed in this webinar. Absolutely, those will become available once we assemble them and hand them over to Elizabeth to clean up and put on the website. So those will be available soon.
Yeah, I know we do have an article, I believe, for the data validation one on the knowledge base, but the ones in this webinar will be a bit more up to date. So I'd recommend waiting to check out those ones when they get published. Just taking a read through the questions panel here.
Yeah, we did get a lot of great questions, and thanks to Dave for helping get to a lot of them on the back end already.
A question from Rug here. I haven't run into this issue myself. Chris, I don't know if you've run into issues with file locks with dynamic workflows. Typically, I find most cases I haven't, working with SDE, file geodatabase, I haven't run into any issues with locks. So I know some users will use, if they are running to locks, say that data is being used for something else, they can use a SQL executor before their writer to clear any of those locks, and then get that to run for them. So that's kind of one of the use cases there, but it shouldn't be any different with dynamic workflows in terms of how that works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point, using the SQL transformers to do that, or you could do that in the SQL before write operation as well. That's a writer parameter. You could technically do it that way. Typically, how I've always addressed the file locking is just by using a feature holder on the canvas right before the writer, or if you are using any group by processing, anything that's a blocking transformer, that also typically clears out the file lock. So there are a number of different ways you could approach this. So it would be interesting to see what your current workflow looks like, and if you are already doing one of those and running into issues, please do file a support ticket for that, because we can definitely get our team to look into the issue.
While Chris and Dan are looking through, I'll just note, if you do have any other questions that come in, we'll leave things running a couple minutes longer, so feel free to leave those in the questions tab, or of course email us info@safe.com. We're happy to help. All right. Are we all good, Dan and Chris?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, huge thank you to the two of you for preparing all this content that you've shared with us here today. If you do have a brief moment to fill out our webinar survey, we really appreciate any feedback at all from our audience. It helps us improve our program. I'll just drop that in the chat now again here. And yeah, we hope you all have a great rest of your day, and many thanks for joining us and for your time.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks for all the questions. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, enjoy.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.